CEOs are being put under increasing pressure to meet environmental, social, governance measures, or risk seeing their shareholders invest elsewhere. To rise to that pressure and meet objectives ranging from environmental targets, workforce diversity goals, through to company purpose and having a well-being culture, boards need the experience, insight, the support of their HR and their reward and their benefit teams. These factors were among the topics that we explored in our recent Aligning Corporate Culture and Human Values research together with Mercer Marsh Benefits. And today I'm joined by Michelle Sequeira, UK Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Consulting Leader at Mercer. Now, before I talk to Michelle, I just want to mention that if you'd like to jump ahead to any specific topics in our discussion, you can see the chapters on screen, or you can click in the video timeline below to access a particular section. So Michelle, welcome. And I'd like to start off today by exploring with you why aligning corporate culture and human values is so critical and why it's so important just now.
UK firms are increasingly cognizant of the need to make sure that their corporate culture, their values, their purpose align with societal and human views. Now, the reason being is stakeholders, whether that's customers, the employees, investors, or even the media, expect organizations to live their company values. And this is, clearly demonstrating that their policies and their practices and their benefits actually fit with what is presented in the outside world through the website, etc. If not, they would risk seeing their shareholders invest elsewhere. They would risk seeing their employees leave to competitors, and even consumers leaving to competitors. And let's be fair, we all know that the media will also impact their brand. So there's an absolute pressure and need to start revisiting this. And that's why it's super critical.
So that's interesting you say that, because that starts to link into purpose. And our research found that purpose is now a business priority. And 60% of our respondents said that they were becoming more purposeful. And in fact, as many as 9%, 1 in 9 of our respondents said they would even sacrifice some profit in order to be more purposeful. What would you say are some of the drivers behind this shift in thinking?
I think there are a couple of reasons, or a few reasons for this. The first is the link to profit, right? So in the report, we talk about the purposeful company, defining a purposeful business as one that recognizes profit is the outcome of identifying and pursuing a purpose that benefits society. And there's a growing body of evidence that actually shows that purpose and profit can be aligned. So our Mercer's Global Talent Trends actually shows that there's a 40% rise in executive concern about consumer interest in ethical products over the last 2 years. And we also know that, Unilever estimates that around 60% of their turnover now comes from brands that are taking action on purpose. And those brands are growing at, I think, 70% faster than the rest of their consumer goods portfolio. So there's, an absolute link between purpose and profit in whichever facet that we look at. And then the second thing is the talent competitive advantage. We know employees increasingly want to work for firms that have a strong purpose and corporate values. 80% of employees say that corporate culture needs to grow now more than ever to be something that is more purposeful. And this is up from 51% in 2013. That is from a global culture survey, which had, 2,000 companies in 50 different countries. So wherever you look, employees are wanting to see more purpose, and if not, they are going to be moving elsewhere.
Michelle, I'd like to broaden out the conversation now about long-term sustainability of business and talk about ESG factors. And we saw that some of the S aspects of ESG, such as employee well-being and diversity, equity, and inclusion, are a focus for HR and also for many boards. But environmental factors are only a priority for around half of businesses, according to our research. How can we get businesses engaged with all aspects of ESG?
Absolutely. So you're right. To achieve that longer term sustainability, definitely the focus on well-being and DEI has certainly shot up board agendas. That said, getting the businesses engaged in environmental factors is becoming more and more popular, and especially CO2 and carbon reductions and environmental sustainability. There are a couple of things that I'd touch on here. The first is organizations really should start considering what areas are most relevant to their strategy and their value propositions to investors, consumers, and employees. There's a role as well for external pressure. So, for example, in France, there is now an ESG requirement in the governance code. In Germany, there's a requirement through company law that ESG should be incorporated into variable incentives. So, there's this external pressure that will help organizations start to focus not just on S, but beyond S.
And that's interesting that you talked about incentives and what France and Germany are doing. What role do you think incentivization has in driving ESG forward? For example, linking it to executive pay and even wider reward strategies.
Absolutely. Incentives has a huge role, in my opinion, in driving ESG forward. We all know, right, that what gets measured, but also what gets rewarded, gets achieved. And our data suggests that 51% of organizations incorporate ESG into both short-term and long-term incentives, and those metrics can be everything from DEI. Some have CO2 or carbon reduction emissions, and I'll just give you an example. A global FMCG company that we were working with, so this goes back to my earlier answer. They made public commitments in respect to the journey to net zero carbon, to reducing waste, to consumer health and DEI. And off the back of that, we worked with them to identify that for 2021, their annual incentives would include 4 metrics relating to these public announcements. And their long-term incentives would be focused on share price and financial metrics, supplemented by one or more ESG measure, with the intention that in due course, they'd have more metrics and more ESG measures as well. So I think incentivization is super important. Currently, it's mainly in executive pay, but some organizations are looking at cascading it through. So if I can just spend a second on your last bit, thinking to wider reward strategies. We know working for an organization which has responsible rewards is rated the #1 preference in Mercer's global talent trends. A third of organizations take this into account when setting salary levels, using approaches based on living wage or global minimum standards. And I think there's a huge opportunity for us to think about our wider reward proposition and making sure it's as responsible as possible.
Michelle, we saw in the research, really interestingly, that there isn't always that consistency between what the board level priorities are and the HR priorities are. And there's also a very clear gap, a very clear difference between policy and everyday practice at line manager level, particularly around areas such as DEI. Why is this an issue?
The role of managers, if we think back a few decades, it's really evolved from just once upon a time just sharing information with their teams to actually owning the experience at the workplace. So when we think about line managers, they are crucial for cascading the company's principles and values into everyday practices. So they really need to advocate, they really need to lean into items like diversity, equity, and inclusion. We all know as well that the experiences and relationships with managers are different between different cohorts. So for example, our Mercer engagements results have found that 4 items that talk about my immediate manager treats me fairly, or there is minimal favoritism where I work, with distribution of work and promotions, Black employees are 7 or 8% less favorable on this item compared to white employees. Female employees are 5% less favorable as compared to male colleagues. So you know that there are differences in the experience. So it's more important now than ever before that we start to make sure that we are aligning with what our wonderful policies say, but the practices of our managers to help us retain our people and ensure that we all feel like we can thrive.
And that's so crucial, that risk. And you talk about equity. One really clear area that comes through in our findings is that limited focus on fairness, particularly within pay strategies. In corporate policies, only 51% said they were addressing pay gaps, and that falls to less than 30% when we look at ethnicity pay gaps and low pay gaps more generally. How can fairness be given a higher priority in corporate thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. This is something that I'm really passionate about. One of our engagement results, my company treats employees fairly, regardless of age, family or marital status, gender, disability, race, religion, sexual orientation. There is a 13% difference in the experience from racially and ethnically diverse colleagues, and the 7% difference between genders. So the experience of our employees is so different, and we need to get this right as employers. In the UK, companies are more familiar with gender pay gap due to the regulations coming out a few years ago, right? But that's looking at raw gaps, comparing overall medians and overall means and coming up with a raw gap. Increasingly, though, organizations are using more robust statistical approaches. So when I say that, I'm talking about regression analysis or multivariate analyses, and that starts to identify what drives your pay gaps. But there's still a lot of work to be done. So, by way of what can we be doing, I'd encourage organizations to be looking at more rigorous methods. But beyond identifying the gap, what we typically also see is that companies find out what their gaps are, but not very often actually mitigate or address it. So our advice to organizations is not just test for it, but actually start to make a difference, narrow those gaps, and communicate to employees so they know that you are actually conducting these analyses, you're building rigor into your processes, and you're actually sorting out or meeting those gaps. If I can just comment on a couple of other things. We're touching on pay equity there, but don't just look at a snapshot as an organization. Look at the whole employee experience. So compare starting pay salaries. Black workers earn 23% less than their average white counterpart. So if we don't test for this at the start, and we've paid people differently when they enter an organization, the opportunities to address that later on, it's more difficult, and look at pay on promotion, look at bonuses, you look at the whole employee experience. And then to touch on your race and ethnicity point, if I may, there are a couple of things that we hear often from organizations when they try to say, I can't do ethnicity pay gap reporting. One is, we can't publish the report because of GDPR. Well, ensure that we let our employees know why we're collecting their data, and there likely won't be any GDPR issues. The second, we don't have the right data. But why don't we try getting it done? And if we communicate about it, then our employees will see that we're trying to make a difference. They'll start to trust you more, and then they might start sharing their data. So let's start thinking about how we can make it happen and go beyond gender and start addressing our pay.
Michelle, you're obviously really passionate with your topic. That was absolutely fascinating. I learned a lot just listening to you right now. So thank you so much for joining me today. These are key areas that leading employers are tackling right now. So getting your insights has been absolutely valuable. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. Really appreciate being here today. Thank you.